Hi, my name is Rodrigo, this is Ether, and today we're continuing our series in the book of Mark. We are in Mark 11, verses 1 through 27. In this passage, Jesus finally arrives in Jerusalem, where his actions set the stage for the plot of his death. But also, through this passage, we learn what it takes to live fruitful lives in the kingdom of God. Jesus arranges to arrive into Jerusalem on the back of a colt, which for those of you who don't know, is a donkey that's never been ridden before. And once he arrives into town, he is received by people putting tunics on the floor and palms, which marked the arrival of a king. That evening, he leaves town, and on his way back the next morning, he is hungry, sees a fig tree and leaf, and when he realizes that it has no fruit, he curses it. Why is Jesus so mean to trees? Once in Jerusalem for the second day, he wastes no time in challenging the establishment and the authorities of the city by driving people out of the temple courts and not letting anybody through. Then that evening he leaves town again, and the next morning when on their way back to Jerusalem, Jesus and his disciples walk by the same fig tree that he cursed and realize that it has withered, and the disciples are amazed. Jesus uses this opportunity to teach his disciples about faith, prayer, and forgiveness. It would be easy to imagine that Jesus' arrival into Jerusalem as a king would be one attended by a huge crowd. But if we really think about it, if that were the case, it would have totally drawn the attention of the authorities. Jesus being welcomed as a king is exactly the kind of thing that the Pharisees would have been all over, because if we know one thing about them, is that they're trying to keep authority all to themselves. Also, the whole reason for Roman soldiers to be in Jerusalem was to assert the authority of the Roman emperor. And if they had heard that there was somebody being welcomed as a king by a huge crowd, they would have stifled that right away. More than likely, who was receiving Jesus as king was a smaller crowd of believers that, even though small, were probably the most faithful followers of Jesus in Jerusalem. Another interesting fact about Jesus' arrival into Jerusalem is that I mentioned before, is that he's riding a colt. Conquering kings, when they would walk into a conquering city, they would usually do it on the back of a white horse that symbolized judgment and authority. But if a king came on the back of a colt, it meant that he came in peace. This speaks to the nature of Jesus and the kingdom that he's bringing in, which is not a kingdom of violence, but one of peace. Not all is peaceful though, as Jesus gets into conflict, first with the fig tree and then with the people at the temple, and it's a very natural question to ask why. And this is where having some extra knowledge about fig trees makes sense. But before I get into that, I have to point out that it'd be very easy to think that these two stories are unrelated, but actually Mark uses a device here that he uses all throughout his gospel that I like to call a Mark sandwich, in which he covers a topic through two seemingly unrelated stories that he structures by telling a story, then going into another one, and then coming back to the first story. See? A Mark sandwich. And that's exactly the case here. Jesus curses the fig tree, then he goes into the temple, and then the next morning, the story of the fig tree is revisited. But what does it all mean? Because the Bible is very clear that it was not the season for figs. However, the Bible also tells us that the tree that Jesus went up to was in leaf, meaning that it was growing new leaves. Usually, a fig tree grew leaves and fruit at the same time, meaning that if at a distance you saw a fig tree that had leaves, it would be a very normal expectation for it to have fruit as well. Jesus curses a tree basically because it's a hypocritical tree. It looks like it ought to have fruit, but it doesn't. The hypocrisy of the tree is symbolical of the hypocrisy of the leadership of Israel, which, just like the tree, looked like it ought to be spiritual, but it wasn't bearing any spiritual fruit. The Pharisees dressed differently, they performed all kinds of outward rituals of purification, but they were not bearing the fruit that God was intending them to bear. The perfect example of this is what's going on at the temple. Jesus' likely conflict with the money exchangers and the sellers of doves is that, like he says, the house of God is meant for a house of prayer for all nations, which more than likely all of these merchants were in the outer court that was meant for Gentiles and was the only place on temple grounds where they could worship God. Jesus is bringing in a kingdom that is for everyone, but under the leadership of the Pharisees, the Gentiles can't worship. Not only that, but the hypocrisy and the lack of spirituality of the leaders of Jerusalem is marked by the fact that Jesus is going to the spiritual capital of Israel, not to be acknowledged as Messiah, nor to be worshipped, but he's going there to die at the very hands of the man that Jesus is criticizing. This turns out to be a great lesson for the disciples because they are amazed that the fig tree is withered the next morning. And Jesus tells them this: have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also, who is in heaven, may forgive you your trespasses. The Pharisees were thought to be able to accomplish great things because of their education and devotion to sticking to the law. But Jesus says that in his kingdom, in order to accomplish great things, we have to have unshaking faith, faithful prayer, and forgiveness. To be fruitful in his kingdom and to be the opposite of a tree that has leaves but no fruit, we have to have faith, we have to be faithful in prayer, and we have to be willing to forgive those who do harm against us.